But on the flip side, those athletes who don't get paid to play money on TV, to play their sport on TV, are youth athletes. What's going to be the fallout from them missing a year of sports? Was the 17-year-old basketball player who was set to have a scholarship, what does it mean that he hasn't played a game in a year? And these are things that we are trying to anticipate, but we ultimately won't really know until we kind of see how things play out and we get a little bit more perspective.
Yeah, and I think youth sports is interesting because it's probably one of the other areas where that's a big part of the social glue,
Absolutely.
right? Like, and you don't have youth sports, that 17-year-old's like feeling really angsty for a year, right?
Right.
Like that's the other thing. So like, I think a lot of people are like, oh, like it almost feels like youth sports in many people's minds gets equated to like a frivolous activity.
Yeah.
That kind of doesn't matter. But I think when you reframe it, it's like, no, this is a group that is about to become an adult. They are at high risk oftentimes for like, basically doing other activities that are not super productive or useful for society. And sports is like one of the best things they could be doing. And then we canceled it.
Yeah.
And so then really try to calculate all of the societal cost to that. It's massive.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the areas where it was challenging to say like, hey, do you want to prevent kids from getting together because of this concern about COVID? And how do we balance that out?
Right.
And I think when you say schools, people are like, oh, they're going to get educated. So yeah, that's a priority.
Yeah.
But if you said after school sports, they're like, oh, that's not a priority because that's after school. It's not scholastic.
Right.
And I could imagine an argument kind of flipping the two and saying, well, actually, they might get better long-term benefit from the sports because that's where they're engaged.
Sure.
And maybe less benefit from the school where they're actually not even engaged, because of the way it's being taught or, whatever. So I can easily see that. And so I do think that there's a lot to be said for youth sports because of the important role it plays in that group.
Yeah, there's obviously is a concern. Is there going to be an increased risk of physical injury because somebody's had a year off and they're raring to go and they're just going to go nuts when they get back on the field? But also what you touched on, that psychological distress, because a lot of our athletes, and I was certainly this way in high school, being an athlete is who you are. It is a huge part of your psyche, and to be denied that by no fault of your own is going to be challenging for a lot of our athletes. And we'll see how it plays out, and there's going to be people who suffer, and it's nobody's fault. I think that's one thing to point out. This is not a Democratic or Republican party. This is a problem. This is a COVID problem, and you had to make decisions that we think were in the best interest of everybody's safety, but it sucked, right? This is just nobody wants to be in a pandemic, and we were, and we'll see what the ramifications of that are.